Hello and welcome to A Creative Perspective with. This week I'm talking to poet Maureen Almond. Maureen, you didn't start writing until 1992. What made you do this?
It's a bit of a coincidence, really. I'd taken early retirement from the probation service. I was a personnel manager there. And I was taking my daughter into school. She went to St Edward's in Linthorpe. And I just happened to see a notice up on the door one day saying, come and join our creative writing class at Grove Hill Women's Writing Group. And I did that. I intended initially just to write articles for women's magazines, and had quite a fit actually when she first came in and said we were going to do poetry, but once I'd done the poetry I really loved it, and I've just loved it ever since.
And how much of an influence has your early life in Thornaby had on your work?
I hadn't realised it had any actually until I came to do the poems in the latest collection called The Works. Some of the poems had been hanging around in my head for a long time, but I'd sort of put them out of my mind because I was concerned about the fact that they were in a way so autobiographical. But it was when I read the Horace Epodes and I realised that, even 35 years BC, the old Roman poet had not shied away from being autobiographical. Although there is some debate about that. Some people think they are less autobiographical. I think they're quite autobiographical. And I realised if it was good enough for the old Roman poet, it was certainly good enough for me. So they, in a sense, reading the Epodes unlocked many of the poems in the works, and I hadn't realised until I came to do all of those and got the 52 poems together how rooted I actually was in Thornaby. I had not felt particularly rooted there, but writing those poems actually made me feel more rooted.
And you've incorporated Horace's Epodes into your work. How have you done that?
A friend of Marie's, Marie's my daughter, when she studied music, and a colleague of hers was studying the classics. I had become introduced to Horace, but like many of these things, there are many translations, many versions of it, and this young girl recommended that I looked at the David West translation, which I really liked, and I stuck with that. And then, because of a previous connection with Corpus Christi in Oxford, Professor Harrison acted as my scholarly advisor, so I was, in a sense, interpreting those Epodes. But I set myself a harder task, actually. They're not just interpreted and brought up to date, because what I realised when I read the Epodes was that there's nothing new in the world, and that was what fascinated me. But when I realised I could update them and bring them to life, to represent life in Thornaby as I knew it just after the war, but I set myself a technically harder task as a poet. What I did was look at the West translation, and I stuck exactly to the West format in terms of stanza, poem length, syllable count in every line. So it not only represents the content of the poem, it also represents the form of the David West translation, and all 17 Epodes are written in that way.
Do you have a style? Could you describe a style?
Not particularly. It was interesting when I did the MA, Poetry MA at Newcastle University several years ago, and I wouldn't have missed that opportunity for the world. It was fantastic. But interestingly, partway through that course, you said to me about style. Maybe what you mean is a voice. Have I got a voice? And it's weird, this thing about poetic voice. But I know while I was partway through the MA, because I was trying to be academic, because I was trying to seem more learned, for a while I lost my natural voice, I think. And okay, I've got it back again now at the end of the process. But I think probably if I have a style, is I relate more in terms of relationships and people. I like to write about real people, which is why I thoroughly enjoyed writing the works. So I'm more inclined to write about people than daffodils or trees. Although having said that, I've just done a book called Tongues in Trees, which is part of my residence in the North Lodge Park in Darlington. But I've made the trees talk, so I've made them into people anyway.
And there are 52 poems in the works. How long did it take to write?
Well, as I say, some of them had been washing around in my head for a long time. So some of them were on the back burner and had been for about 2.5 years. Once I'd made up my mind that the collection was there and reading the Horace Epodes had freed those up, probably about 1.5 years, 2 years. But some of them had, as I said, been on the back burner for a while.
And at what point did writing poetry turn into performing it?
I can't really answer that because I've been reading my work for a number of years now. I've been writing altogether for about 12 years. And I've had a long history of having read my work. I don't particularly see myself as a performance poet. I really don't, because I don't do anything from memory. I don't trust my memory. So I think I read my work rather than perform it. I don't see myself as a performance poet particularly. Although having said that, I love reading my work because I love the immediacy of audience reaction. I think that's great.
How did you start working with Steve Thompson and Maggie Parker?
Well, that was a coincidence because for a couple of years I've been invited into the University of Teesside to do the a women's thing that they have every year to do with, giving women lots of opportunities. And I've been invited in 2 or 3 times now to run workshops, poetry workshops, to give women different opportunities of trying different things. And the last time I was in doing that, I just happened to meet Maggie, and she said that she liked my work. And I didn't really give it all that much thought at the time, but then when I decided to pull this bid together for Arts Council, I thought about Maggie and contacted her again to say, would she be interested in representing the work digitally? And she was. And that was how it was going to be. And it was after I'd had a couple of meetings with Maggie, really, and set a lot of the things in motion, that she recommended Steve to me. That's how I got involved. And I've enjoyed the involvement ever since with them too. It's been brilliant.
You've published several books. At what point did you feel it was right to publish your work?
I don't know that I've ever given that particular thought. I had been studying poetry at what was the outreach part of University of Leeds, which was Harrow Road in Middlesbrough. Sadly closed down now, but I did a lot of courses there and met some fantastic local writers like Andy Croft and Rebecca O'Rourke and so on. And in actual fact, I was approached by them at a time when they knew I had a reasonable body of work, so that my first collection, Taylor Tax, which I think came out in 1997, it sort of just happened because I was approached by them to submit a manuscript, and I loved every minute of that. It was wonderful. The second big one, Oyster Baby, which was published by Biscuit, again that came as an approach from the publisher, because it's incredibly difficult to get poetry published for anybody, and particularly when you did start till late, which I started quite late.
There seems to be a bit of a poetry movement going on at the moment in Teesside. Why do you think that is? Is Teesside a naturally creative area?
I really don't know. If you want my honest opinion, I think there are several reasons for it. As I say, first of all, when we had the writing groups, which were part of Leeds University, those connections became very strong, and we ended up building up a very strong body of quite good writers. And in a sense, even when Harrow Road closed down, which sadly it did about 2 years ago, I believe, by then there'd become a strong body of writers in Teesside, and some of them continue to meet voluntarily at Hallgarth School. And of course there are, because of that strong body of writers, quite a number of people now in this area have been published, and we've got local publishers like Mudfog. I'm a member of the Mudfog board now. I wasn't at the time, obviously, when Taylor Tax was produced, but I'm on the Mudfog board now. We've got Andy Croft's new publishing company called Smokestack, and then there's the ones in Darlington. So there's quite a few little outlets in this area now in the Tees Valley.
And what's your connection with Oxford University?
That happened quite coincidentally. My daughter was doing a degree at Cambridge at the time when I was doing the Oyster Baby collection, which was my MA presentation, and I had been introduced to mythology at Harrow Road, actually, a course being tutored by Cynthia Fuller, who's also a fantastic writer from Tyneside. And she'd introduced me to mythology because I'd never studied the classics or mythology when I was at school. And what she opened up was fantastic, and I discovered Ovid. I'm sort of backtracking a little bit on this, but I discovered Ovid, and I updated some of the Ovid stories, and they are in Oyster Baby. And quite coincidentally, when I'd taken Marie back to Cambridge Uni, I saw a note on a board saying that there was an Ovid scholar there, someone called Dr. Philip Hardy. And so I emailed him and said, I've just brought my daughter back to uni. I notice you're an Ovid scholar. Next time I come, could I perhaps meet you, because I've been writing some Ovid-based poems? And we arranged to do that, and he was very gracious. And when I got back home, he asked me to email him some of the poems I'd been writing, which I did. and he thought they were wonderful. You know, he sort of helped me with the interpretations. And in fact, when Oyster Baby was done, I did a thank you for him in the book. When I went to send him a book, a complimentary copy of Oyster Baby, I found he'd moved from Cambridge and he'd moved on to Oxford, and I just wanted his address to send on a copy of Oyster Baby, which I did. So I sent Oyster Baby off, and then that was fine. About 3 or 4 months passed, and I got an email from him saying, there's an Ovid colloquium at Corpus Christi College in Oxford. Would you like to attend as a student? It's only £10. So I thought, oh, yes, I'll have some of that. That sounds great. So I sent off my £10, enrolled as a student on this Ovid colloquium. And a colleague of his who I'd never met, Professor Harrison, I asked if he could get me some college accommodation, which he did, and he said, oh, I won't charge you for it. And just purely by way of a thank you, because he was giving me free accommodation, I sent him a copy of Oyster Baby. And within a day, I had an email back saying, never mind coming as a student, will you come and read for us at the colloquium? And it was a wonderful experience. And so that was my first introduction. So I went off and I met Stephen Harrison for the first time, and then after that I've started writing the Horace poems, and he's been acting as my scholarly advisor ever since. And I've just been back again. I was invited again in September of this year to take part in a classics conference, a reception of classics, which I've done, and as a consequence of that I've now been invited to address the Classical Association conference in Newcastle University next April. And then Corpus Christi have invited me back to do a sabbatical, just some study time in September next year at Corpus, with access to the Oxford Library, so I'm quite looking forward to that.
There are probably people across Teesside writing poetry on the back of bus tickets and used envelopes. Do you have any advice for them?
Keep writing. Doesn't matter where.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay.